Good evening. You're watching NDTV. I'm Rishika Barua. There has been a lot that has been happening this week, but let's not forget we're still living in the midst of a raging pandemic. And to answer all your questions on the coronavirus, we have with us the head of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Dr. Randeep Guleria. Thank you so much, Dr. Guleria, for being with us. I want to begin by asking you this week about the ICMR Sero survey, which has actually gone on to say that a large section of our population is still very susceptible to the risk of the coronavirus. But interestingly, has also said that the risk depends on where you live. Would you like to break that down for us?
Yes, so there are two things. One is the sero surveillance shows that still majority of the population still hasn't got sufficient antibodies, and therefore there is still a risk of getting infection in our community. And therefore, we still need to follow the practices that we've been really harping upon in terms of physical distancing, in terms of wearing a mask, in terms of hand washing. What it also shows is that there are certain areas where, because of, let's say, overcrowding, because of other factors, the seroprevalence may show a higher number as compared to certain areas where it may be much lower. So when you're looking at seroprevalence of an area, it's basically an average. You'll have certain areas where, because of population density, because of higher number of cases, you may have a good antibody response. Whereas in other areas, which could be different localities, different colonies, where the serosurveillance may show a lower number and a significantly larger number of people, especially those who are elderly or at high risk, may still have a chance of more serious infection.
Right. This the same sero surveys also indicated a lower sero prevalence in slums in Mumbai, for instance, but a slightly higher sero prevalence in in other urban localities, say high rises. What do you make of this distinction?
So the differences may not be that significant. We must also remember that sero surveillance is based on a sample size.
Yes.
You're looking at a relatively small sample and you're sort of extrapolating that to the whole population. Now, a lot depends how the sample has been collected. Have you done a good sample size collection? Have you done a truly representative sample? Sometimes you may take a sample which may not be truly representative, may look at those individuals who are willing to come forward to give their blood sample. Serosurveillance means you have to take a blood sample to see whether there are sufficient antibodies. So there may be a little bit of a selection bias that people who are wanting to know whether they have antibodies come forward, and therefore you may get a little bit of a difference in what actually is the prevalence in terms of the disease in that area.
Right.
So I think we just need to look at it broadly rather than actually going into a very minute detail, because that may not be correct as far as the data is concerned.
Right. Also, after looking at this ICMR Sero survey, the latest one that's been published, one of our viewers has actually asked a question on when do you think India can achieve herd immunity?
So that's becoming a difficult question because of two reasons. One is, if you look at a sero surveillance which have been done in various parts of the country, the numbers are not rising very dramatically. There's usually just a 5 to 10% rise in the sero prevalence from previous studies. Sometimes it's even less than that. What it suggests is that the number of people who are actually getting protected or who are protected to get herd immunity is not going to reach that 60-70% level anytime soon. Secondly, we also are now having data of reinfection, which means that whatever be your protection may gradually wane over a period of time, especially those who have had mild infection. And therefore, to say that you are now protected for a long period of time is a difficult question. You could say that you are having antibodies, you are protected for 3 to 6 months, but what happens after that? Does it wane? And are you still prone to getting a recurrent infection? Because then that will have a huge implication on herd immunity.
Would you then say that the concept of the herd immunity is in a certain sense flawed, or perhaps even go as far as to say that it's a myth in the current context?
So I think it has a lot of flaws, and if you are looking at herd immunity developing naturally, it's going to take a long time, and we may lose a number of lives if that happens. We can also get herd immunity through the vaccine path.
Yes.
That is, we vaccinate a large number of people and they get the antibodies, and that is lasts for a longer period of time, and therefore we are able to achieve herd immunity. In my mind,
Right.
we will probably achieve significant herd immunity to some extent by the vaccine rather than by a natural method.
All right, that's interesting. Also, the other big development, of course, has been Unlock 5 as we, go on to reopen different sectors. I think one of the biggest cause of concern and question has been, is it safe to reopen schools? Should parents be thinking about sending their children back to school?
Opening schools is going to be a big challenge because we really need to look at the number of cases in that area. Are they showing a sustained decline? And if we're able to show that the number of cases have come down substantially, they are showing a sustained decline over 14 days, then one can really start looking at this issue of opening schools. Otherwise, schools are an area where there is bound to be lack of physical distancing. There's bound to be lack of children wearing masks, and therefore has the potential of actually being an area where the infection can spread rapidly to homes, and children can take that infection to their parents or their grandparents.
Yes.
They may not have a serious infection, but they may carry the infection to others. Therefore, I think we really need to look at it minutely, area by area, rather than opening schools in a hurry.
And it has in fact been left to the discretion of the state. So each state will basically be deciding for itself. But, for parents to note, is it safe to send younger children to school, perhaps safer for older children, because social distancing norms, COVID-19 protocols may be better understood by older children? What is your reading of the situation?
So I agree with that. Also, I would say that parents need to look at how is the pandemic behaving in that area, in their locality,
right,
or in where the school is. And if they're finding that still there's a significant number of cases in that area, there is no downward trend, I think it's better to avoid going to school. If you are finding that in your area, the number of cases has dramatically come down and there's been a substantial decrease over a 14-day period, over a 2-week period, then you could actually consider sending your the child to school. And if you can avoid younger children,
right,
it would be a safer option, because obviously they will not be able to follow all the norms of physical distancing and wearing a mask.
Well, I think that's very, very important advice there, Dr. Guleria. Also, is it safe to go to a cinema hall? This is a question that has been asked by a lot of our viewers.
I know a lot of us miss the cinema halls, the type of theatre joy that we have, with all the other snacks, popcorns and things like that. But having said that, I think there are some things that you will have to postpone. And I would say the same thing, that we still haven't really come to a situation where we can say the number of cases in our country has significantly come down and the pandemic is at its end. Therefore, I would actually be careful about asking people to go to cinema halls.
All right. So things may be opening up. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's what the doctors are prescribing. A game-changing 15-minute COVID-19 test has been cleared for use in Europe. What is this test, Dr. Guleria? If you could tell us more about it, and how reliable is it?
So as we are going forward in terms of diagnosing COVID-19, we are realizing that what really we need is a good point of care test. A test which can give us a good idea whether you are positive or negative within 15 minutes, and that can help the healthcare workers, the public health administrators to decide how to isolate an individual, how to quarantine an individual, and thereby prevent the spread of the infection. A lot of work is going on now to try and develop these good tests which have a high specificity and a good sensitivity. And this is one such test which is trying to look at the antigen and to see whether that can give us a good result. We already have in our country the rapid antigen test, but obviously we know that in certain situations it doesn't perform very well. So the work that is going on both in Europe and various tests coming up in the US are trying to really refine this and come out with tests which are better in terms of point of care. And I think over the next few weeks we will have many such tests entering the market. We had one test which was even by an Indian local company which is looking at a CRISPR technology. Many of them have to really come into the market and be able to show that in real life situation they perform well.
Is rapid testing therefore the way forward, the key to containment? Because, what we are seeing happen all over the world, especially here in India, is that more and more things are only opening up. One isn't really seeing things locking back down. So, is rapid testing therefore key to containment of coronavirus?
I think so. I think we need to look at coronavirus from two broad points of view. One is to be able to get a result very quickly rather than waiting for hours or days to get a result, because for each hour that we delay the result in a positive case means that he can infect more and more people. So we need to have a test which is good in terms of specificity and sensitivity and is a point of care, a rapid test. And that is one area where a lot of research is going on, so that we are able to take a call, and especially when you're looking at opening up and having no lockdown.
Yes.
So when it comes to such tests, you could easily do these tests in, say, offices. You could do that in schools. For example, a child has fever, to test and decide immediately whether the child is infective, and you need to isolate the child.
Yes.
So those are the things that we really need to do that. But the second thing that I would like to emphasize is that we still need to understand that even you can be symptomatic, or you can be infectious in the pre-symptomatic stage.
Absolutely.
So even when you have no symptoms, you can still be infectious, and therefore any close contact should also be tested, and we need to develop a policy as far as that is concerned. And at the same time, physical distancing, wearing a mask and hand washing still are very, very important.
Yes,
even in countries like the United States.
Something that you've reiterated, on all the shows that you've been with us.
Correct.
The other interesting development has been that scientists now, appear to have developed a new tool to understand virus mutations. My question to you is the virus affecting people differently across the globe? Is it playing out differently in individuals based on ethnic differences or genetic dispositions?
So there is a difference as far as the virus and the host is concerned. When we look at any disease process, we look at three broad factors: the virus, the host, and the environment. So if we start looking at the virus and the host, what we're finding is that in different ethnic populations, the behavior of the virus is slightly different. We are having a much lesser mortality in Asian population as compared to what is being noticed in the Western population. It's not that much related to the mutation, because studies have not shown a significant mutation in the virus. There has been one mutation which has been highlighted, the D614G, which suggests that this virus may become a little bit more infectious, that it may spread the disease more rapidly than in the past, but still it does not. It's not more virulent. It's not causing more serious infection. So I think what is actually causing the difference is more host related, individual related. It could be age, it could be the BCG vaccine, it could be other factors, rather than the virus having mutated.
Right.
We also know by various studies that unlike the influenza virus, the coronavirus doesn't mutate that rapidly, and it's not a virus which changes its so rapidly in terms of both infectivity and in terms of what we will have to do as far as the vaccine is concerned.
Okay. Because, speaking of virus mutations, and the reason why this question is also very interesting is because the deaths per million population in India has been one of the lowest. This is what you just mentioned as well. And our recovery rate has also been the highest in the world. So, is this connected? Are the two things connected, you feel?
I think so. And like I said, these are connected more to factors that we've been talking of. One is, of course, that we are a younger age group, and we know that in a younger age, there is a better recovery and mortality is low. It's also related to the one theory, that is the BCG vaccine, that all of us get BCG vaccine at birth, and that gives some immunity against viral infection. There is good data to support that. And also the fact that we are exposed to other 4 strains of coronaviruses which cause flu-like symptoms, and there may be a cross immunity, and we may have some immune protection because of being exposed to other types of coronaviruses which cause mild illness.
Can we also then say that the viral load in India has been lower, say, than what we've seen in Europe or in the United States?
That is a difficult question, because I don't think people have looked at that, and viral load will vary depending on when you do the test. The viral load will vary from day 1 to day 2 to day 3 to day 4.
Right.
And if you do your nasal swab on day 1, you might get a different viral load. If you do it on day 3, the viral load may be different.
Right.
And that is why I don't think we have enough data to really differentiate the viral load in
Okay.
different populations.
The Oxford vaccine, is now expected to roll out within the next 3 months. Do you think A, this is practical, and B, will this really be the game changer as far as the pandemic is concerned?
So vaccines will be a game changer. The challenge is that we have to have a safe and efficacious vaccine. And we need to do a trial in a large number of patients, in thousands of patients. And in phase 3 trial, not only do you give them the vaccine, you let them get the infection. They are exposed to the viral infection. And there is actually what is the proof of the pudding in terms of how safe was the vaccine, how effective was the vaccine.
Right.
We know that sometimes there can be adverse effects which occur once you get the infection. The vaccine itself can cause some sort of a vaccine derived enhancement, which may cause more side effects once you get the infection.
Right.
So once you see the vaccine is safe in terms of the local reaction to the vaccine and in terms of what it does. But actually you have to see it in a large number of people who are vaccinated and who get exposed to COVID-19, both in safety and efficacy. Once we have that data, then only can we say that we have a vaccine which is safe. And even after that, you need to monitor these patients for months to come,
Right.
because sometimes the side effects may be of a later onset.
It's very interesting. You're actually saying that in phase 3 of clinical trials, patients or rather participants are infected with the virus to actually gauge the efficacy of the vaccine, because the Russian vaccine.
They are allowed to go into the community and get the
Right.
infection or be exposed, because
Be
you have
exposed.
two groups.
Okay.
One is the vaccine group, the other is the placebo or the control group.
Right.
And then you see, did the vaccine group get less infection as compared to the control group?
Right.
That will actually really show you that this was protective.
Okay, that's a very interesting, very interesting thing to actually know, because the Russia vaccine has also proven to be safe in the early trials, and this is a question that a lot of people now want to know. With the amount of vaccine trials that one is reading about and tracking, will the world actually need a combination of different vaccines to be able to fight COVID-19?
So that's the interesting part, and this is, will we have only one vaccine? And we know many vaccines need to be given twice a month apart, so they need to be a booster is required. Do we need to give a combination of vaccines which are of different platforms, and will that actually give a better immunity as compared to a single type of vaccine?
Yes.
That is a question which I don't think we have an answer for, because vaccine trials are currently being done individually by individual companies or individual manufacturers. There has to be at some point in time sort of unity with all of them to see if they were to combine their data or to look at different permutations and combinations. Would that actually be better than one vaccine alone?
So that's going to be something very interesting to watch out for. There's a viewer who sent a very interesting question. How can those who suffer from sweaty hands, and many people have a medical condition, how can they maintain hand hygiene?
So a lot of people have a lot of hydrosis that is there.
Yes.
They tend to sweat a lot and their hands become wet. I have some patients who are not able to give their exam because when they're giving the exam with the pen, the sheet becomes totally wet and smudged. So in such a situation, you need to really look at what you can do. Sometimes a hand sanitizer, or more frequently washing your hands, or using what we call a disposable tissue does help, that you keep putting that on your hands and keeping it moist and then disposing that off properly.
All right. There's been another very interesting phenomena, and this brings me to our FAQ section. Are social bubbles a myth? Can you actually exist in social bubbles, given the fact that we know we've already been in this pandemic for a few months? We perhaps have a few months, if not years, to go. Is this a myth, and how do you choose a social bubble if it's not a myth?
So social bubbles are created just to say that you can get added protection. To some extent, they are a myth because nothing can be 100% protected. People have tried various types of social bubbles in terms of regular testing, daily testing, isolating the whole group and quarantining them and not allowing them to interact with others from outside the bubble. But there has always been data which suggests that despite all of this, a leak does happen and infection can spread. The chances of spread of infection in a social bubble is less than compared to what it is in the community, but it is never something like 0%.
Okay. The next question is, what SOPs should be followed in social gatherings given the fact that we're entering festive season?
So the first important thing is that it's better to have a social gathering outdoors than indoors. We do know that if you have a social gathering indoors and it is no good cross ventilation and you have a central air condition, the chance of infection spreading among individuals is much higher. Secondly, you must try and, if you're doing it outdoors, try and maintain as much physical distancing as you can. Try and spread it out as much as you can. Decrease the number of people. Make sure everyone mandatorily wears a mask. Have hand sanitizers available very easily, or maybe on each table, and encourage people to eat at a distance when they have their mask down. So some basic principles we need to follow if it is very essential to have a social gathering.
So if you must socialize at all, that is of course. The other FAQ is, are cloth masks effective in crowded places?
So if a cloth mask is worn properly, that is, you cover your nose and mouth and it fits tightly around them so that there is no air leakage occurring from the side of the mask or from the space between your nose and your cheeks, then the mask is very effective.
Okay.
Often people usually wear a cloth mask and they will put it on their mouth but not on their nose, or they will it will hang loosely from their nose and mouth. Then it is really not effective. So you must wear a mask properly, and you must also be sure that when you take it off, catch the strings and take it off. Don't catch the cloth in the mask while removing it, and be sure that you wash your hands before wearing a mask and once you've taken it off.
Well, absolutely. So, a whole host of protocols need to be followed, and mask etiquette needs to be followed even if you are wearing just a cloth mask. Thank you so much, Dr. Guleria. I'm afraid that's all we have time for on the broadcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you.